So let's talk about food and mental health. So why do we even need to have this conversation? Why do we need to talk about food? Ideally, we would not need to talk about food. Ideally, all food would be healthy and the right things would be available and they would be like in harmony with our genetics and our bodies, and then we would not be talking about food. And the problem is that that's not how it is, right? So food changed so much, right? There was a dramatic change in how we eat 10,000 years ago with the onset of agriculture. And then, a couple hundred years ago with industrial revolution, huge changes. And then, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, right? Like these are very short time scales, and food keeps changing. Right? It's still changing now, and how we're eating, what we're eating, food products, what's available from agricultural production keeps changing, right? And it's changing rapidly, and basically the issue is that our genetic makeup does not change so rapidly, right? So we have this old genome that are amazing, but adapted to something that was there, a long time ago, right? 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago. And then our genes evolve, they adapt, right, through natural selection to the new environments, but that happens very slowly, right? So we are still in the process of adapting to agriculture, right, to a change that happened 10,000 years ago. And the changes that happened with agriculture were not subtle. Like 70% of everything that we eat, all the calories, are novel food items, like things that did not exist pre-agriculture, right? So majority of what we are taking in are these things that our body is still figuring out. Dairy, right? There was no milking wild cows, right? Suddenly we have domesticated animals that can be milked, right? Introduction of dairy, we're still adapting to dairy. Some people are ready and can digest lactose and casein, have no issues with dairy, and some people are not, right? And that can be in different groups, different populations around the world. But a lot of people are not able to tolerate lactose, have stomach issues, right? Some bloating, gas, and discomfort from lactose, right? But maybe in another 10,000 years, or maybe another 20,000 years, right? If all of us continue to have dairy, right, there'll be some natural selection, and people who are better at digesting dairy, and because of that have better nutritional status, have more babies, maybe that gene will become more prevalent. Maybe not. Same with other things, right? Some of us are better adapted to grains, which is another product of agriculture, than others, right? Some of us are better at these like large loads of carbs, and some of us are not as good at dealing with those large loads of carbs. So, so changes in glycemic load, glycemic index, glycemic load are a huge change, right? And we are adapting to it. But because we're not fully adapted even to the change from 10,000 years ago, and these more recent changes, 200, 100 years ago, for sure we haven't had a chance to adapt. And then more recent changes, right? Introduction of things like high fructose corn syrup 50 years ago. It does not exist in nature, right? It's a kind of sugar that's cheap to make. It's made from corn, which we have available in abundance, and becomes this stable, easy to use, cheap sweetener. But our body doesn't know what to do with it. Right? Like digesting this kind of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, is much more difficult for our body, right? The amount of insulin needed, right? The burden on the liver is much higher than digesting sugar from a natural source, right? So it's all these things together, all these changes, and there are a few other changes that add up and they put a strain, right? So they are taxing our system. It's just working hard to just adapt and digest the foods that we're eating. And we're like, this is normal. I've eaten this thing my whole life. Yes, but your ancestors haven't, right? And not just like, oh, my grandparents, right? No, think like your 10,000 years ago, right? Ancestors, were they eating this? Right? So that's why we need to talk about food. And the other elements of this, this is not individual, it's a societal thing. What's introduced into the food supply is not that well tested, right? So there are hundreds of different chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, all kinds of, things from plastics, and that we really only know so much about, and we really don't know at all how they interact with each other, right? And how they deposit in our bodies, and what is the impact of this accumulation over a lifetime of these many, many, many different chemicals in our bodies, on top of this high glycemic load, which is straining our metabolism, and this excess of calories, but not enough micronutrient situation, right? So we might be facing this availability of food, right? There's lots of food available, lots of calories, but per each food item, fruit or vegetable, the content of nutrients now, compared to a few decades ago even, is lower, right? So how we are eating is we are overfed in terms of calories, but we are undernourished in terms of nutrients and minerals, right? And that can result in this picture of like, a person doesn't look malnourished or underfed. They may actually be overweight, but they are undernourished, right? And all these different chemicals, the different strains on our bodies, the micronutrient deficiencies add up together and cause a lot of stress on our systems. And that may manifest as detoxification not working so well, right? So things accumulate and your body has a hard time detoxifying. Methylation not working so well. So methylation is how our genes are turned on and off, how the environment communicates with our genome to adapt, right? And all these micronutrient deficiencies may affect that. Inflammation, right? So our whole systems might be inflamed. That might come from the gut, but eventually become systemic. That's oxidative stress, right? So we're just constantly making energy, metabolizing things, and that throws off electrons, so free radicals, right? It's just like when you're making something, there's like a little bit of mess that's made, and that mess has to be cleaned up, right? So then we have other mechanisms to mop up all those free radicals, eat them up. Those are all the antioxidants, but those systems can become strained, right? So you end up with this these fundamental root cause issues in the body, right? Where metabolism is thrown off, there's a buildup of toxins, there's inflammation, right? There's a shortage of certain nutrients. There maybe is excess of certain macronutrients or buildup of fat tissue or fatty liver, right? And the whole thing adds up together to contribute to disease, right? And these are diseases of civilization, right? Traditional societies, pre-agricultural societies, these issues were not there, right? Such as, obesity, arthritis, high blood pressure, cholesterol issues, heart disease, right? All these things that are like huge right now, right? And affect millions of people, potentially all of us living in these developed, Western societies, eating these diets, and it's driving disease. And if it's driving overall disease in the body, it's also driving brain issues, right? So all that inflammation doesn't just stay here, right? Like it affects the brain too. You end up with neuroinflammation, lots of free radicals and oxidative stress in the brain, right? Maybe also buildup of toxins, trouble with methylation. Of course, that will affect the brain over time. And for one person, it might be depression. For another person, it might be brain fog. For someone else, it might be anxiety. For another person, it's OCD. Right? For another person, it's like executive dysfunction. For someone else, it's something else, right? It could be, it's just we have different vulnerabilities, we have different brains, different genetics, and how these different stressors accumulate and build up from how we eat will impact each person differently. So that's why we need to talk about food, right? It's not just like random, right? It's a huge thing that's driving these root causes of illness, physical illness, and mental illness. And if we want to, instead of just like then putting a Band-Aid on top of a huge problem, by adding an antidepressant or some medication, really the work is to address these root causes. And that's fundamental shifts in how we eat, fundamental shifts in how we live, fundamental shifts in what chemicals and toxins we allow into our systems. And unfortunately, these issues are systemic. No matter how hard I try to control, the chemicals in my environment, there's only so much I can do, I can buy like cleaner furniture and buy organic food, but I'm still exposed to, New York City air pollution, right? And whatever is in the water supply. Yes, I can use a filter, but to some degree, I'm exposed to the water, air, right? And everything else that's like I'm touching and is floating around and is in a food. And many of these things we don't even know, right? We don't even know what chemicals are there. And, we make new discoveries, right? I just read this book, To Die For, about the dyes and things in fabrics. Right? That never crossed my mind. Now I have a whole new thing to investigate and look into, right? Like what are all the different chemicals? It also keeps changing. I used to think sardines are great. And then it turned out with microplastics in the ocean, the sardines, they float close to the surface and they eat a lot of that microplastics. So it's like, okay, I guess they're not a health food anymore, right? And it's really hard to know which fish are more or less contaminated with microplastics, right? Where like farmed fish, not great, but wild fish are exposed to everything out there in the ocean. So it's a lot to think about, and you could either like get overwhelmed and throw your arms up and just give up, or it takes some dedication and effort to try to figure it out, and just some simple guidelines of like eating in a more clean way or eating more whole foods, foods that your ancestors 10,000 years ago would recognize as foods, right? Not a novel thing in the shape of a teddy bear, right? But something that is clearly a vegetable, clearly a fruit, or clearly part of an animal, clearly a nut or a seed or a root, right? Rather than something that's processed. So these are basic things, right? I do think that there's something to trying the paleo type diets, right? Pre-agriculture, just skip the whole agriculture thing and skip anything that's like novel development, because our bodies are not adapted, right? It's like it's doing an experiment on yourself, right? Can my body handle this? We don't know, right? It's hard to know how much stress whatever that novel food item is putting on your body, right? What you are probably fully adapted to is the things we ate 20,000 years ago, right? So just think about that. What was available 20,000 years ago, right? So that's a question to ask when you're choosing your foods. And to really consider, right? Like, oh, that might be easier on my body. So every choice, right? Every choice, it will increase or decrease these root causes: inflammation, free radicals, stress on the body. And without getting too like paranoid and too tense about it, right? Because you also need to live and we can only do so much. right? But this effort, this general balanced effort, okay, without panicking, to improve how we eat, right? And reduce these root causes of disease for ourselves and for people around us, right? And hopefully it will also be whole societies, right? Thinking about how do we feed children, right? What do we put in school lunches? You know, the things my kids get at a New York City public school, you know, it doesn't sound great. And, you know, what are people fed in a jail, in a prison? You know, like we have research that shows that if you just improve the food in an incarcerated population, violence rates go down, right? Incidents go down. People function better and feel better, right? What's being advertised to adults, to children, right? We're all sensitive to it, right? If you're being flashed candy, right, and sweet, cute-looking animal things, right, like that's going to affect what children think is appropriate to eat, right, what they identify as food, right? So this isn't just like one individual family, one individual person, right? This is all of us as a society. This is, you know, we need like kind of a systemic government effort, right? It's grassroots. It's us like lobbying for that to make food clean, but it's also you're voting every time you buy food, right? So every time you choose to get local, organic, something from a small farm nearby, right? You're supporting that, right? That you're casting your vote, right? And that counts and that adds up. And I see that food quality is getting better. At least, you know, I'm in New York City, but things that were not available that, you know, I had to like look and search around for, you know, healthier, cleaner things, more and more organic things are available, right? Like more and more just healthier, less processed foods are available, right? So we're driving this change as a society through the choices that we make. Right? So stay calm, stay relaxed, but also stay like engaged and mindful in fighting for your own health, right? And fighting for protecting yourself from these root causes of illness. It's worth it.